Hi everybody, I'm Netta Weinstein, and I'm excited to talk to you, very close to my face. I'm excited to talk to you today about conversations and my recent work on listening. And I'm a little bit more nervous than I would be because my kids are here and they'll be able to tell you whether I practice what I'll be preaching. But I hope to, spoiler alert, convince you that listening plays a role in our relationships. So before I start, I just wanted to thank my collaborators, because this is not work that I do alone. And without Nicole Legate, Guy Itzchakov, and my PhD student Tia, this work couldn't be what it is. So I appreciate their instrumental and non-instrumental support in this and other work. So often, when I've thought about what autonomy supportive or supportive relationships look like, I think about the relationship as a whole. So is, my mom autonomy supportive? Is my dad autonomy supportive? Is a friend autonomy supportive? But actually, if we think more deeply about what that means, it's really about these key moments in our relationships that shape that global perception that I'm supported or not. And so I've increasingly come to believe that single conversations, moments in our relationships, represent kind of big pivotal snapshots of the relationship, and they actually change potentially the trajectory of how I feel to somebody else in my life, how I behave around them, how I react to them. And so just looking at individual conversations, I think, has a lot of power to teach us about what relationships look like and how they affect us. And conversations in particular are fascinating because we have these short snippet exchanges, and we actually convey something to our partners when we have those moments. But conversations where we disclose things, discuss important things, make decisions together, those are moments where each partner conveys a lot of information to the other about what kind of support they're willing or not willing to provide, or how they feel or think about that person. So they're really kind of key in, I think, shaping the relationship as a whole. And when we think about conversations, we often tend to think about the person who discloses, who talks. So I think the default in a lot of literatures in psychology, and especially in literatures like organizational psychology, are things like, how are you an effective speaker? What are you willing to share? The person who's bringing new content to the conversation, in this case partner A, is the important partner. But actually there's a partner B, and that partner B attends and responds. They don't necessarily need to bring in their own agenda or their own items, but there's some way that they're responding and reacting to the person who shared that changes the trajectory of the conversation. And so I think the first thing I want to argue to you is that listening isn't a passive process of somebody just kind of being there and receiving the content that's being shared, but rather it's an active process, and it's a rich process, and it's one that shapes the conversation as a whole. And I'm not the first person. I think we can all intuitively know that. I'm certainly not the first person to kind of say it. I think one place where it's recognized, at least kind of implicitly, is in change-focused relationships, like psychotherapists or coaches will say to you, yes, of course, high quality listening, active listening, that's deeply important to what we do. And so there's an awareness that actually listening well to one another can create change, can help bring growth and insight and integration, the kind of stuff that we can do to help one another. And so I kind of also want to argue to you that what therapists already know is something that's applicable to us researchers across all domains of life, all the relationships we have. I almost struggle to think of a relationship where listening doesn't matter, or where that receiving doesn't matter. And so I want to talk to you a little bit more about the way that listening is thought of. So when I say listening, we might think, okay, so actually you're all here listening to me, so thank you very much. So that's a great first step, is attending to the other person. And I really like this conceptualization that my collaborator has. He's kind of just simplified it to, high quality listening, really good listening, has to do with providing attention the way that you're doing now, but also demonstrating comprehension. So in a conversation, you don't just kind of stay quiet, but actually the partner who is listening conveys, I get it, I get what you're saying, I heard you saying this, I get the takeaway. So comprehension is also very, very important. And finally, the listener has positive intention. So in some way they demonstrate a positive intention toward the speaker. And the idea is that actually all those things need to be there for listening to be really effective. If you have attention but no comprehension, that you're not going to be conveying high quality listening. If you have attention and no positive intention, equally bad. You need to have all three for listening to have that supportive element. And I just want to elaborate a little bit on each one. So if we think about attention, it's not a simple thing to do. So attention is, of course, having this kind of careful attention, but part of what you're doing as the listener who's attending is creating space for the other person to express themselves, actually what you're doing for me here. Part of that also has to do with avoiding external distractions. So, cell phones can be disruptive to that full attention that you give somebody. And internal distractions. So planning what you're going to do for the day, or what you're hoping to get out of the conversation yourself, anything that we as the listener bring into that conversation that doesn't allow us to sit in the moment with the speaker can really disrupt that process of really conveying rich, deep attention. And comprehension as well is complicated. So comprehension is often talked about as understanding the words that I say. And in some contexts, that is enough, actually. I might say that this one is one of those. If you understand the words I say, I'm doing good. I'll take it. But actually, in close relationships and in relationships or conversations that really matter, you also want to understand the nonverbal behaviors. And they don't always align with the verbal ones, right? So somebody could say, oh yeah, I'm doing good, but actually they look really sad and kind of say, oh, are you sure you're doing well right now? So sometimes quite often, hopefully, we use nonverbal behaviors to really comprehend what the person is saying and understanding the kind of meta message. So taking all the information that we know about people, the things they say, the way they look, and understanding what they're truly trying to tell us about themselves in that moment. So again, comprehension is not a simple thing to do. It's quite complicated to do well. And positive intention as well is a complicated construct, because if you really dig into it, it looks very different in different contexts, different relationships. So my colleague Guy, he works in organizational psychology, so they use positive intention, which I find a really dry way to talk about it. I like to think of showing love, showing affection, showing care. And when you think about parental relationship, having a positive intention toward your child it's kind of a relatively easy thing to do. Really conveying that deep love and valuing is what children really need and want. So the relationship should sort of define what positive intention looks like. And it might be that in certain more professional settings, respect becomes an important part of that positive intention. And of course, I can't help but think that acceptance, I should add, a lot of these things are in my head. So I add citations that sort of point in the right direction, but this is how I understand these constructs. So acceptance is one where I think it's part of showing that positive intention. It's hard to have positive intention to somebody and sort of reject them as they speak. So complicated construct. So I'm going to be arguing for the rest of my talk that listening can support autonomy. That's the main takeaway, and whenever anybody has asked me what my talk's about, I say listening good and autonomy good, and so that's the key message. But I want to talk to you more about why I think that's the case. So if you think about these things I just described to you, they sound like autonomy supportive, autonomy enhancing activities. When we listen well, we take the perspective of the other person, we show acceptance, we give them the space to express themselves authentically in a self-congruent way. They feel valued and accepted, and they feel choiceful in guiding that particular conversation. Because actually one of the things that a good listener does is they kind of sit back and say, you know what, you lead. I'm going to receive what you say and I'm going to respond to it, but I'm not going to try to change the way that you're talking. So it's a very agentic experience, I think, for a speaker to receive high quality listening, and a very accepting one. And Did I do that right? Yeah, I think so. So essentially, in short, what I'm arguing is that listening is an autonomy supportive strategy. And we know that there's other autonomy supportive strategies, so it's not all of what it means to be autonomy supportive. So we know that, autonomy supportive also has to do with supporting values and interests, offering a meaningful rationale, offering choices, minimizing use of control, and there are other things we do to be autonomy supportive to others in our lives. But I think the important takeaway is that let's not forget listening. And I think there are a few studies where listening is measured as an item in a scale that might look at autonomy support, or listening is one strategy in a kind of more comprehensive autonomy supportive intervention. But I think it's a really, really important autonomy supportive strategy that should be considered in its own right. And so the first thing I want to tell you is, think about the role of listening as a separate important autonomy supportive strategy. The other thing is I think listening provides the foundation for being truly autonomy supportive in some of these other ways that I talked about. So I think it's actually a foundation for building an autonomy supportive relationship. If you think about, for example, what it means to take perspective, well, it's hard to take someone's perspective if you don't carefully listen to what they say and ask them the kinds of questions that elicits more from them. It's hard to really support someone's values and interests if you're not listening for their values and interests so you know what to support. It's hard to argue, to give someone a meaningful rationale, to really help them understand why something's important if you don't know how they would perceive what's important. I think it's very easy for us to tell people what we think is important until we get to know them. So I actually think, and I should tell you right now, I have no data to support this today. I do have some data, but it doesn't help with this part. But I think if we keep doing this research, what we might find is if we start with listening, we can do other autonomy supportive strategies better as well. And the old version of this talk said I'm going to argue you can't be autonomy supportive without listening. I'm not sure that that's the case, actually. So I decided in most cases, it's very important to first be listening in order to be autonomy supportive. So one of the things the models that I want to talk to you about today, and I think one of the ways to approach this is through relationship motivation theory. So if we think of listening as an important autonomy supportive strategy, it is expected to satisfy psychological needs, and especially for autonomy and relatedness. And so one of the things that we know is that when people are autonomy supported, of course, they feel more autonomy needs satisfied. And also when people are autonomy supported, they feel more related, because it's kind of hard to be autonomy supported and be like, but I really don't like that person. It's a very intimacy creating experience. It's a closeness promoting experience. And that psychological need satisfaction actually is an important reason why autonomy support in relationships leads to well-being and positive behavioral outcomes. And I kind of have a model. I send you to this paper to learn more about the topic, but it's very tiny font, so you have to be very dedicated. And I spelled my name incorrectly. I'm really throwing you off here. But here we kind of set out an argument that listening is an important autonomy supportive strategy, that it should satisfy autonomy and relatedness, and that helps us to really engage in the conversations that we're having in the relationships, to be vulnerable, open, non-defensive in those conversations, and to really benefit from the conversations we have with people. So I want to talk to you about a number of studies where we test this model in different contexts, different relationships, different ways. And we also use different kinds of experimental designs to do that. So the first one is actually going to be a study where adolescents, 1,001, it was going to be 1,000, so we have one bonus. 1,000 adolescents watched videos of moms being autonomy supportive, of listening or not listening well when their adolescents self-disclosed that they had transgressed by vaping or been rejected from their peers because they didn't want to vape. So that's one kind of experimental design where we might illustrate this is what listening looks like. How would you respond if you were listened to in this way? But I also want to show you some study results from live experiments later, where research assistants who are trained to listen well or to listen kind of moderately, that is, they pay attention, but they don't do a lot of the other good stuff, interact with our participants. And in some, we ask people to think back to a time when they were listened to well or not. So the first study asked adolescents to watch videos, and then they reported things like their anticipated autonomy need satisfaction after that conversation. So they said, if I were the person, would I feel in these autonomy supportive ways, and would I also feel relatedness, need satisfaction with my mom? Would I feel cared about, closeness and intimacy, and like I could really trust my mom? And I just want to show you, I don't know if I can I do a little pointer? Oh, it might not reach. That's all right. So top left, it's just a correlation between the perceptions that the mom was listening well, so across conditions, perceptions that the mom was listening well, and autonomy need satisfaction. So we see a pretty robust correlation that transcends age. So participants from ages 13 to 16 kind of agreed that they would feel more autonomy need satisfied to the extent that they perceived high quality listening. And the same top right was the case for relatedness need satisfaction. So they would feel more closeness and intimacy. But actually, we saw then downstream effects of that, or outcomes of that. And the first one in bottom left, C, number C, is that actually they then anticipated that if they had this perceived high quality listening, that they would also have well-being, more positive emotions, higher self-esteem, and less negative emotions. And this is probably the most important outcome, I think, of this study in a ways. They would also be more willing to self-disclose to their mom in the future. So if you think one of the things that we hope happens in close relationships, but honestly even in professional relationships, maybe in all, is that we feel free to share things about our lives, partly to seek support, to seek help, to vent. So we want to be able to encourage kids and others to share. And here, kids felt that they would be more likely to share their secrets, both good and bad, with the mom who had listened well. And if we look at a mediation model, we see that when we model them simultaneously, both relatedness need satisfaction and autonomy need satisfaction mediate the effects both of self-disclosure, unself-disclosure intention, and well-being, which basically meant when participants saw the high-quality listening mom, they anticipated more autonomy and relatedness need satisfaction, and they, as a result of that, they wanted to, or were more willing to self-disclose in the future, and they anticipated they would have high well-being, kind of supporting the idea that we had that actually this is a really important way to support people. But in this study, this was a kind of hypothetical study, so I want to share with you another study where we looked at the way that we can support and bolster and even create a healing experience for speakers who self-disclose to somebody who listens well. So in this study, we asked participants to share a time when they felt rejected with an experimenter, to talk about a time when they felt rejected. And so the first thing they did was they sat down and wrote about a time in their lives where they felt rejected. And one of the things that we know from the literature on rejection is thinking about those moments actually makes us feel lonelier. It's a difficult experience. So we were trying to mitigate that loneliness through the connection that is created between the speaker and the listener. In that moment of talking about it. So this is very much like a tiny therapy session in a way that the experimenter provided. And what we see is that kind of as expected, we see the same model that high quality listeners reduced loneliness when speaking about rejection. So they were able to kind of protect well-being, protect the self in this difficult conversation. And both relatedness and autonomy, again, mediated the effect. So I think for me, those simultaneous mediations are really important because it's really showing us that it's not just that sense of intimacy, but it's also that sense of being able to be kind of truly agentic and genuine in that moment. And a third study that had a similar design, participants this time talked to experimenters about their prejudice. And in these studies, what we wanted to get at was, if you're having a kind of threatening conversation about an attitude you hold, it might not be one that you're particularly excited to talk about, and it could be one that could lead you to be rejected. So we thought, my goodness, that prejudiced attitudes provide quite a challenge for listeners. And we had experimenters, again, provide high quality listening or moderate quality listening. And we see actually similar support, but in this case, autonomy was a more important mediator for the effect of listening on state self-esteem. So we were looking for those reductions in self-esteem as a function of discussing this part of myself that I might not feel great about. And again, listening was an important way to do that, and needs, and in this case, autonomy in particular, mediated the effect. Now, I had a bunch of reviews for this work where reviewers said, what about competence? And I wrote very lengthy arguments why I don't think competence is relevant in this context. And then Dvori Saluk, who's in Haifa, went out and did a study on listening and needs, and she stuck in competence to defy me, I assume. And she asked participants, in this case, to disagree. So the studies that I've shown you have really had a very supportive listener. This is someone who just attended, but they didn't kind of cause any trouble. They didn't challenge the prejudice. They didn't punish the transgression. There was no real conflict. In her study, what she had people do was think about who they would hire based on a CV, so kind of create a little bit of an ego challenge, can you do a good job selecting a person? And then they shared a choice with a Confederate who disagreed with them on whatever their decision is. There was no winning in the study. But in one condition, the Confederates who disagreed provided high quality listening before they did that, and in the other, they provided this moderate quality listening where they just kind of attended, and every once in a while there was a nod. And what she found was that there was full mediation in this case for the listening manipulation. So initially, she was looking at how manipulating listening led to optimism to resolve the conflict. So we're beyond well-being now. We're about sort of depolarization and conflict resolution. And she found that those participants who were listened to well said, what, I think we can work this out. I'm hopeful that we can find common ground. But when she put in 3 psychological needs, all 3 mediated the effects of listening on optimism to solve the conflict. And so it was that supportive context, competence included, that mediated the effect. And I want to take this research to the real world and kind of tell you, actually, we presented this slide a little bit, or some of these slides at the last SDT conference, but now we have lots of data behind it, which is really exciting. So we've tried to apply a lot of these principles around autonomy, support, and motivation, and this is me and Nicole Legate working together with UK policing to create better, more autonomy, supportive inclusion training for police officers and staff. And there's a real need behind doing this, and I like to use these very shaming newspaper articles as a starting point for a conversation about how we shouldn't shame police officers. So essentially there's a lot of visibility around racism in policing and a lot of pressure on their side correctly to do something about it. And the best they have is unconscious bias training, which we now know from many studies doesn't really help very much, despite lots and lots of money spent on it. So we thought, hey, we know how change might, be come about. And so we thought, let's actually use the motivational principles we have to create a day-long training program where we try to really inspire buy-in around change. And there's a lot more to this work than I'm presenting now. And this was a picture I presented 3 years ago as well, but this was our starting point for Nikki and me working with policing. But we found a partner in Hampshire Constabulary who's been really, really supportive in this work. And there's a lot more here, but one of the things that we measured was perceived listening in the room. Darn it. Okay, I'll just say really quickly. basically, we tried to create open dialogue as a starting point for autonomy supportive change. Listening was a really key part of that. And what we saw was that indeed it supported psychological needs, all three needs again, led to greater insight about the topic of inclusion bias and myself in relation to it, and led people to have ethical voice, want to create change, be willing to talk to a colleague who's behaving inappropriately, being racist or bullying. And so it had these kind of positive downstream outcomes. And in short, I think what I want to leave you with then is, I think there's a lot more to learn about how listening is important, what conversations, all of life's domains where it might be important, where we forget to talk about it and we need to be talking about it, what its boundary conditions are, we don't know what those are, how it provides or doesn't provide a foundation for challenging action for the kind of more active things we do in relationships. So I just want researchers across domains to kind of consider it when they do their work, to think about what it means in causal tests, but also in really deep, important, challenging, threatening, scary conversations. Conversations that really, really matter, I think can really benefit from listening, to take outside of Western perspectives and to think about its components. And I'll just say, I guess, that one of the things that I'm hoping to do in the next 3 years is to take this to a cross-cultural context. And I already have some collaborators working with us on the project. So Lenia in Peru, Wilbert in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is green on there, it's just really tiny. Nargis in Turkey, myself in the UK. And so we'll be developing this work, and I invite anybody who is interested to please come talk to me about it. And this will be my talk in 3 years' time, I think. Thank you so much.